Hello everyone, my name is Simon Chadwick. I am Professor of Eurasian Sport at EM Lyon Business School in France. I'm also one of the editors of GeoSport, the platform. Today I'm joined by Madeleine and by Brian McCulloch, who I'll get to introduce themselves in just a moment so they can give you the full array of who they are and what they do. But I'm really, really happy to have Madeleine and Brian here with us today because they are two of the foremost experts, researchers, writers, certainly in academia in the field of the environment and sport. It's an area that I think is hugely important, arguably the most important issue facing sport today. But I think from a personal point of view as well, it's something I feel very passionately about. So I'm really grateful to have Madeleine and to have Brian with us today. So if I could start with you, Madeleine, and just very simply, if you could tell us who you are, where you are right now, what you do, and obviously tell us something about the research that you're engaged in.
Sure, thanks for having us. We're very excited to get the email to join you on this. So I'm Maddie Orr. I think everybody calls me Maddie except my mother and sometimes Brian when he sends emails to big groups and forgets my name. And I am a sport ecologist, a new term that we kind of invented a little bit. And I'm an assistant professor of sport management at the State University of New York at Cortland for another few weeks. And then I'm going to be a sustainability fellow at the University of British Columbia in Canada, which is where I'm from. So going home to Canada, and my research focuses on the impacts of climate change on sport. So what is it doing to winter sport? How are we adapting to heat conditions? How do we respond to natural disasters and themes of that ilk? So that's a little bit about me. And together with Brian, we lead what's called the Sport Ecology group. And I'm sure Brian will get into more of that. So I'll leave that part to him.
So Brian, I've heard, somebody has told me that you speak passionately and at length about sport and the environment. So Brian, again, same question to you.
Yeah, thanks.
Who are you? What do you do? And it's over to you, Brian. We're going to sit back and listen.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to be able to talk about our research and about a very important issue, which is getting more and more attention, which is a great thing. My name is Brian McCullough. I'm an associate professor at Texas A&M University. This is the same institution that I got my master's and PhD from. I have my hat trick of degrees in sport management. I went to Ithaca College, which is actually a rival of SUNY Cortland, where Maddie's at currently. So we also even got into a bench clearing brawl when I was on the baseball team there with SUNY Cortland. But those rivalries stop with our collaboration, so that's a good thing. Yeah, so my research, I've been doing this now for over 12 years. Focusing on sport in the natural environment. And as Maddie said, it coined under the term of sport ecology, bidirectional relationship between sport and the natural environment. And my focus kind of has three different aspects to it. One, assessing the environmental impact of sport, whether that be kind of collective organizations or individual organizations. And with that kind of mindset, it's, what gets measured gets managed. And that relates to the second aspect of my research, which is looking at the judgment and decision-making processes that managers or practitioners go through to implement or not environmental initiatives, and then also how they develop those strategic plans. And then lastly, the third area, which has kind of gotten the most attention recently, but is looking at how we can influence sustainable behaviors of sport participants or spectators through marketing campaigns and the various motivations for those campaigns that an organization would want to go through. And we've seen a lot of positive results from that. Maddie and I have done a lot of great things, whether that's with working with the Commonwealth on how to better assess SDGs 12 or 13 across the Commonwealth, working with Sport Positive, which is based out of England, and trying to bring a academic voice to the issues that practitioners are confronted with. And that's kind of been my main motivation and the driving force behind the sport ecology group, as Maddie mentioned. I was going to say Madeleine. Sometimes I go with the formal name, but anyways. And so the sport ecology group, really our main intention there is, one, to distribute high quality research that can inform practice. And we don't want to be just academics that are talking amongst ourselves in this echo chamber. We actually want to use our research to influence practice. And then now that I'm back here at Texas A&M after some short stops along the way at Seattle University, where I developed some curriculum to teach students on how to implement these aspects into their careers. You know, the land grant status of our institution is trying to find those practical problems and finding realistic solutions on how to move the needle, particularly addressing climate change and adverse effects of that.
You talked a little bit, both of you, about the sport ecology group. Could you tell us a little more about this group and who's involved and what you do? Madeleine? Yeah, sorry, Maddie.
Sure.
Maddie.
Yeah, so we are a team of 14 academics based across multiple countries now. I guess we're North America, Europe, Australia. And we all have slightly different angles on sport ecology. So as Brian alluded to, sport ecology is the bidirectional relationship that the natural environment has with sport. And so what we mean by that is that sport is going to be impacted by the natural environment. That's kind of where my research comes in. And the reverse is also true. Sport has an impact on the natural environment. And that's really kind of where Brian focuses his energy. But each one of us falls along those lines somewhere in different ways. So we have, people who work specifically around college sports and how to influence young people and college, the college environment, which in North America is the biggest sports system we have right now. We also have folks who specialize in transport structures around big events. And so, for example, Dr. Andrea Collins at Cardiff University is in the geography department at her school, geographer by training, and she specializes in how do we reduce transit emissions around events. And so really this can come from a number of different angles, but our team comes together around 4 pillars. So research and teaching is our bread and butter. Those are 2, pretty straightforward. And then the other 2 are public scholarship and industry liaison. And Brian alluded to this, but we work with a number of different parties to not consult so much as advise on here's what the latest data and science shows related to climate change and sustainability in sport. And here are some opportunities that might exist to move the needle. And so that looks like going to industry conferences. In some cases, it looks like showing up at the actual meetings or at the events for these organizations. And so we've had a presence, for example, at X Games Final Four, which is the big basketball tournament in the US, Super Bowl, and a number of other smaller events in our communities. And we do this to make sure, like Brian said, that we're having an impact on the ground. It's not just writing an academic article, which is really important for establishing the information that we bring to the table, but actually taking that step of bringing it to the table and engaging it in a meaningful way. So this has been really exciting for us. It's been a bit of a whirlwind. We grew a little faster than we had initially anticipated, which is a good problem to have. And so we launched on Earth Day in April 2019. So we're about that 1.5 year mark. So we like to joke that the Sport Ecology Group is a toddler with all the anxieties and rambunctiousness and growth that comes with. So it's exciting. One of the big parts that we both really enjoy is our grad students. We have a program called the Grad Student Mentorship Initiative. Brian runs it. We have 16 students, 17 this year, from different countries, more or less all over Europe and North America. And so we get together once a month and we have conversations about, how do you develop a research agenda? How do we write a really good abstract? How can we support these young people in developing academic careers in this space? And that's really rewarding for our membership, because we all came from a place where when I went through grad school, when Brian went through grad school, there wasn't really anybody who did what we did. And so we were bringing together concepts from way out of left field. And it's helpful to be in a community where we all kind of get it, and then we can kind of move forward and we don't have to get into the weeds on what's the concept of sustainability for 20 minutes before starting the conversation. So we really enjoy that project as well. And there's a number of other little ones. You can visit our website, sportecology.org. They're all listed there.
Okay. So Brian, if I could turn to you and can you give us a sense of sport and the environment? Because I'm sure that there will be lots of people out there who will think about rainforests and melting glaciers and can't make that connection to basketball or soccer in the United Kingdom and Europe. So can you give us a sense of the nature of the relationship between sport and the environment?
Right. I mean, this is really just taking a very practical approach and looking at how climate and weather patterns are changing. I mean, granted, this is more right up Maddie's line of work, but if you were to look here in the United States, games are being rescheduled, relocated because of extreme weather events, and those are deeply concerning. Whether that be a hurricane that's coming through, and granted, sport isn't necessarily the main cause of why there are more hurricanes or the intensity of those hurricanes, but sport is definitely being impacted by that. And you can even look at different reports that have come out from environmental and sport agencies about how cricket and soccer are being impacted across the world because of extreme weather events, whether that be extreme drought or extreme weather systems that come through and drop a tremendous amount of rain. Here in the state of Texas, American football is king. The Friday Night Light mentality is true. I can attest to that. And what we start to see here is extreme heat events too across the state. And organizations, whether that be interscholastic, high school sports, or college sport, really needing to adapt their policies to ensure the health and safety of their student athletes. And that's something that maybe is not commonly thought about, but that's one aspect. And then one of the things that Maddie, myself, and Nick Watanabe at University of South Carolina focused on is not only the production of sport and the environmental impacts that come from that, but also the consumption of sport. And some of the consumer behavior research that I've done really looks at transportation, as Maddie alluded to with Andrea Collins and her work on trying to get people to choose more sustainable ways of transporting themselves to different events. That factors into the game day experience. And so a sport organization has a business case to be made on one, being environmentally responsible. A lot of practitioners that are very proactive in the space view it as innovation. And even working here within our athletic department, which are, I would argue, one of the most progressive institutions, despite the fact that the other labels that Texas A&M has on it with regards to being progressive, they see it as a business case, and not just to save money, but also do things that are on the forefront of what's going on in the space. And that means, yes, increasing the efficiencies of our buildings so we are consuming less energy. And, with some minimal investment, you get a major return. One example of that would be the Seattle Mariners. They made some small upgrades to the automation of their buildings, and they saved $1.7 million in the first year and a half. Then they upgraded their stadium lighting to LED. They reduced their energy bill by 75%. I don't know anyone that wouldn't want a 75% reduction in their energy bill. And it's pretty remarkable from the business case. Then on top of all that, another Seattle team, the Seattle Kraken, the new NHL team, hockey team that's being introduced there, they have a lot of advantageous things because of policy that the city of Seattle and the state of Washington require. But that really puts them in a very advantageous position to be a leader in this space, to being very proactive, minimizing their environmental impact, and then making it much easier to purchase offsets to offset the aspects that they can't reduce or are not able to at this point.
Mm-hmm. So there are obviously situations where we can see that sport is being impacted by the environment and it's not their fault. And then there are obviously other ways in which that sports organizations can engage to help reduce carbon footprint, for example. And you mentioned energy bills. but if I could go on to a third dimension with you, or third element, it seems to me, where sports pollute, or where sports are engaged in environmental degradation. Are there particular examples that stand out for you? That are, the most obvious one for me is motorsport, but I guess there are others. So how do you see that? How do you view these organizations?
Yeah, Maddie, do you want to jump in on that?
Sure. I think we have to think about, the word sustainability gets thrown around a lot. And I think we need to think about what that means, when we're having this conversation. And really, at the crux of it, it's about not using resources more than we need and preserving them for future generations, right? So knowing that, I don't think that at the moment in their current formation, there is such a thing as a sustainable mega event right now in their current form, right? It's not to say there won't ever be. It's not to say there's not plenty of opportunity to make them more sustainable, but really when we're thinking about an Olympic Games, a FIFA World Cup, we're talking about flying in tens of thousands of people to one place for a short period of time, for the most part to use facilities that are new or being upgraded for just that particular purpose, that may not be used again to the same extent or fully used, and using an extraordinary amount of resources to do this. And then there's all the extra stuff. So the food on site, the merchandise, the hotels, and so on. The good news is that means that there's plenty of opportunities to reduce the impact, right? And so there's no shortage of work for us and people who do what we do to pin down, here's the best opportunity to drop your emissions overall. Here's the second best and third best opportunity. And I think what we need to keep in mind is right now, we're talking about degrees of unsustainable sport events because they're not really truly sustainable, but there are plenty of sustainable solutions. And it's about talking about those individual solutions, nailing down what are the best ones, how do they work, how do we deliver them quickly, and distribute them around the world so everybody has access, right? And so I think about, for example, we know with transit, and I'm going to come back and pick on it as many times as I can, because we know that transportation accounts for the vast majority of emissions from any sport organization or event. If we can find clever ways to move people from point A to point B that don't involve flights or that involve fewer flights, that's a big win, right? And we need to celebrate every little win and every big win we can get. So I think there's a lot of people who are working on this in the industry. I think actually we have some very clever people working on this in the industry, and you mentioned some of them earlier, Julia Pele, Rockstar. Some of the people at the IOC who are developing some of the frameworks for doing this and rolling it out, brilliant people. And I think it's just a case of we need to make this more front and center so that those solutions, the scope of capacity these individuals have to affect the change they want to affect is greater. Because right now, that's just, we're working with unsustainable systems. And so it's about making those little changes over and over consistently, always chasing that next 10% improvement. To get to that kind of big scale change ultimately.
Well, one of the things that I listen to you, it's going through my mind is the pandemic, and obviously people haven't been traveling as a consequence of the pandemic, and so that has had an impact upon people driving to games. Or what do you see will be the legacy of that, if any? Will there be a legacy?
Yeah, I get hesitant around comparisons of the pandemic with sustainability for a couple reasons. One of them is I don't want people to think we have to stop everything and have people sick and unwell and dying in order for us to have a sustainable world. I think that's just not the case, right? So we have shown people that it's possible, which is great, but I really don't want people to think that we need to pare down on all of our life experiences in order to have a sustainable world. I think there's a lot of people for whom the pandemic has been a very, very, very negative experience, particularly in this industry where people are losing jobs, right? Losing opportunities. So I think that there's lessons to be learned in terms of how we develop, for example, the bubble. I think the bubble's a really interesting creative solution to tournament play, for example, or preseason. There might be some creative solutions there. I don't know that I want to borrow the pandemic solutions as a long-term thing. I think we need to think more creatively than that, because I don't want people out of work and I don't want people to be sick. And, I think it's an interesting starting point. It's cool to prove that we can do it. I just don't think it has to be at the expense of the losses that we've incurred.
Yeah. Sorry. I was just going to piggyback on that a little bit. People are social beings, and I think that's the kind of the biggest lesson that I've learned, especially with two little ones at home that are wondering why they can't go over to their friend's house across the street to go play. But sport is the same way, that it's social, and it has a lot of identity that's tied to it. Sometimes that identity gets kind of blown out of proportion, but those aspects are really, really important and are critical. Now, sport will need to adapt to make sure that it's the industry as a whole, to diversify the revenue streams, so that if something like this were to happen again, I think it's more likely that people will be willing to restrict attendance, just because it'll be not so far in the rearview mirror in the future. But with that, in these aspects of trying to be as sustainable as possible, it's making those considerations. UEFA does a really good job of assessing the environmental impact of attendees' travel to the tournament, and then offsetting that. And granted, offsets aren't the best way to go, but again, how are you going to make the Super Bowl less appealing to go to, in certain aspects, or the World Cup or the Olympics? And so these are aspects that, need to come into those conversations, to find those viable solutions, again, to make it as sustainable as it possibly can. Just by driving in a very short distance into the office today, I had environmental impact. Just by getting out of bed, I had an environmental impact. And so it's just trying to, again, find the most sustainable ways of going about things.
And that's really a really interesting perspective to hear. One of the things that kind of caught my attention, I think, during the pandemic was obviously the growth in console gaming and esports. But hey, that has an environmental impact. And I was even reading things around the environmental impact of a tweet or an Instagram post, which I thought was an incredible amount of detail, but obviously every time you press send, it has an environmental impact. So that's I think it's a really interesting area. So I don't want the pandemic to take us off in the wrong direction, because I don't see that as being the central issue here. It is about the environment. And so to move on to the current state of affairs, Brian, could you tell me where are we right now in terms of how sport is responding, what governments and various agencies are doing to work with sport? And I guess in very simple terms, are we making progress?
I think we've made some small strides. I think we definitely have notable organizations, and those notable organizations could be denoted in the United Nations Sports for Climate Action Framework as signatories. Those are kind of the organizations that are leading the charge. But if you were to look at the total number of sport organizations across the world, we got a long way to go to get them to be signatories and committing to those aspects. With these notable organizations, you are seeing them actively consider, again, how do we integrate this into our operations to be more efficient? And again, then that extends them into different waves. And we've written some papers kind of about the environmental movement and characterizing it in the mentality of waves of this movement. But within those waves too, we kind of talk about there's ebbs and flows. That the pandemic is a great example here in the state of Texas. We were able to have 25% capacity at sporting events. And you saw the reintroduction of single-use plastics again, which is something that, again, you thought was behind us, but it reemerged because of the consumer confidence that needed to, and comfort that needed to come because of the pandemic. And so I think we see some steps back, but then also what I've started seeing in my conversation with different sport organizations is that a lot of organizations that have been slow to adapt this have quickly become accelerated, like the implementation of ticketless ticketing and paperless ticketing. And that has advanced organizations, they would say, 5 years down the road than where they would have been. And because of this adaptation that the pandemic has caused, I understand you don't want that to be the main focus here, but I think that offers an opportunity for organizations to quickly implement things that had been discussed or there was internal resistance to doing, because we don't know how our fans are going to react to this. And so this provides a great opportunity. And where we start to see this again is in organizations starting to look at how do we improve our procurement, and we're reconsidering every single thing of our operation, because of the pandemic, but how can we make that more sustainable? Because the seed has been planted, and in a lot of ways, it's been given it time to grow, and organizations are able to consider that. So for instance, here on campus, our waste diversion rate, which was surprising to me, pleasantly surprising, was around 55 to 65%, which is very, very strong. But then now that it's like, okay, well, what's the opportunities to improve this? And then we said, well, implement composting into that aspect, food waste. And the projections are very strong, but they were able to talk to partners that are willing to engage in this aspect. And those are the types of conversations that I think that we're seeing. But to get to your main point, the gateway drug, we would say, Maddie and I have joked about with regards to environmental sustainability initiatives is, recycling programs. It's very visible to fans. It's a way for an organization to signal to them that, hey, we care about the environment, but it's also an extremely low bar to do, but an extremely complex program to implement and do well. And so that's kind of the initial step. But then organizations can also consider things behind the scenes that fans aren't commonly going to see. They may not notice, if you're not in the sport management field, that they upgraded from incandescent to LED lights, and that's a huge step forward and has dramatic environmental savings, but also economic savings as well. But that's kind of the initial steps that organizations are doing. They are hesitant on the whole to promote this to their fans. And some of the research that Jonathan Casper and our group has done would kind of indicate that's for two reasons. One, they're either afraid that fans are going to say, you haven't gone far enough, and why aren't you doing more? Or on the opposite side, why are you doing this? You should be worried about winning. And sometimes sport fans don't see sport organizations as an actual business that have to make these decisions to improve their efficiencies and bottom line.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked already several times about various different organizations, Maddie. Can you highlight for us sports organizations, be they teams or governing bodies or events, where you think they are getting it right and they are going in the right direction?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch, right? And I think the reason there's a bunch is that everybody is trying to take on what they can take on right now. And again, it's about that incremental improvement. So, I think the fact that the IOC has a whole entire branch for sustainability and a whole office for right now, it's a great move, right? What that will produce in terms of tangible outcomes and improvements, we have yet to see, right? And that's going to depend on how every individual organization host committee takes that on. But it's a step forward to see that we have those people in place. And I would say that any organization that's hiring a full-time person to do sustainability is doing the right thing right now. And this is something that, to link it to diversity and inclusion, we've seen these positions really change in scope over the years. And so I think sustainability is probably 10 years behind EDI, but if you think about equity, diversity, and inclusion positions, 10, 15 years ago, we were talking about hiring a coordinator level position in an HR department. And almost every sport organization was thinking about that. Many did it, right? But that person didn't have quite enough power to really change stuff. Then over time, we've seen that become a manager, a senior director, in some cases a VP, head of a senior director of HR, whatever that position is. And that has really changed the extent to which these organizations are really engaged in this in a meaningful way. And there's a long way to go with that, don't get me wrong. But I think in the same way, sustainability is a few years behind in the sense that we now have a number of organizations that are actually hiring a person to be a sustainability coordinator, and that's awesome. The more organizations we can get, and I can think of a few, there's a few organizations within the NFL, for example, that are taking this quite seriously. The Minnesota Vikings, the Seattle Seahawks, the Philadelphia Eagles all have a sustainability person full-time on their team. That makes a big difference. And we may not always see the difference, but it's happening and it's there. And a lot of it is behind the scenes because a lot of sustainability work is kind of dirty work behind the scenes, right? It's talking about low flush toilets. Like, you may not know that when you look at it, right? But that's happening. Within, I would say that the football world, I guess, the football system in the UK has taken great strides in the last few years. They've got, I haven't seen a single building, new facility go up or be upgraded without having some sustainability certification attached to that. And I think that's another signal that, we're moving in the right direction. At the college level, we're seeing a number of schools, for example, take this on within their athletics department. And again, nowhere near where we need to see it happening. But it's that we're going to see that long-term progress hopefully happen in the same way that we've seen it with EDI, where it's going to start with that coordinator. They're going to implement those small projects, and over time it's going to grow, right? And when that happens, when you see it get to the person at the top, you end up with an organization like the Forest Green Rovers, right, in the UK, who've really ingrained sustainability into every aspect of the organization. So I don't want to say that those organizations that have just a coordinator because they're just getting started are doing it wrong. I think they're very much doing it right. I think it's something that happens over time. And it looks different depending on where you are and what's important in your region. If you're in, Phoenix, Arizona, or somewhere in the desert, water is a great concern. So, water usage has to be a priority. Whereas if you're in Miami, we're talking about, let's make sure that nothing gets destroyed in a hurricane, because then durability is sustainability and we're not replacing everything all the time, right? So it's going to look slightly different depending on where you are. The other big thing is, and we don't often talk about this, but in some respects, the sustainability opportunities that an organization has are linked to the existing infrastructure in a city. So a sport organization doesn't have the capacity to turn around and say, we're going to build a new metro transit system. It's not how it works, right? If you don't have that access to a good system, it's really hard to implement that solution of sustainable transit. Likewise, not every city has, composting facilities or recycling facilities that can take all the right stuff. And so you are, to an extent, limited to what's in your environment. And the more we see cities take this on, I think the more opportunities await the sport organizations.
Mm-hmm. An interesting one. Again, as I've been listening to you, talked about different sports, and I guess we could talk about different countries. Do you think attitudes are different in different sports?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, at least the response to different racial injustices here in the United States would definitely indicate that, one, the leagues have responded differently, but then also the fan bases respond differently as well. And so the same would be true within sport with regards to environmental sustainability issues. Although I would argue, I mean, our research has been able to demonstrate that you can leverage fan identification and the social norms that come with that identification to your advantage. So Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, very conservative area of the country, the United States, is very successfully leveraged place identity and fan identification to get fans to act sustainable. Same thing here at Texas A&M. We're able to tap into our core values of leadership and selfless service and responsibility, self-responsibility, to be able to say, this is what we do as a good ag. And the same thing has been leveraged at University of Colorado at Boulder, which is a much more progressive area of the country, especially there in that town, that they are able to leverage that. And, people will follow suit. Not saying that sport fans aren't smart. I mean, they very much are so, but because of that collective identity, they are able to move in that way. But definitely there are responses that are different. And because of that, I think, everyone wants to see, ideally would love to see a cookie cutter approach. And just like Maddie mentioned, it depends on the city infrastructure. It depends on what's important in your region. Again, water conservation makes sense in Arizona, not so much in Seattle, where it's literally falling out of the sky so much. And, those types of aspects come into play. And so you have to adapt not only the initiatives that you're going to launch, but then how you're going to engage your fans. Some data that we had when I was up at Seattle indicated that, a Seattle Sounders fan would react very differently than a Seahawks fan. They play in the same facility, and are coming pretty much from the same, different zip codes, but they are going to react differently. And that all has to do with the brand characteristics of the team and the demographics, psychographics of the fan base.
Mm-hmm. Thinking in terms of everything you've discussed today, what do you think are the enablers and what are the inhibitors So what enables you to make progress, and what stops you? What stops these sports organizations from making progress?
From my interactions, and this is just to juxtapose two institutions. Granted, Seattle University's athletic department looks very different than Texas A&M. Seattle University didn't have American football. Their budget was about $18 million a year. A&M has about revenues of upwards in a regular non-pandemic year, upwards of 145 million. So drastically different institutions. But with talking with upper management and approaching the athletic directors and senior staff about different initiatives, Seattle University, despite across campus having a deep commitment to environmental sustainability within their athletic department, was very resistant and did not necessarily want to pull the trigger to implement different initiatives, which was deeply concerning to me. It seemed to be a disconnect. Here at Texas A&M, the same pitches I was trying to make for 2 years at Seattle University, in 2 minutes, they're more or less like, okay, what else do you got? Type of thing. And it's like, whoa, this is way different. But that's the mentality. I think the buy-in from upper management, whether they see that as kind of a cutting edge, leading edge type of thing, or just seeing it as it makes business sense. And this is irrespective of the example that I provided. I think that's what Sport Ecology Group and a lot of what we're trying to do with our research is starting to show, like, look, this is your gut feeling response on why you don't want to do this. Here is data that would show either within your specific fan base or nationally why you're in some ways wrong about that assumption. And so these can kind of open up people to being more receptive of implementing these different initiatives. And so, but the buy-in has to come from the top. University of Washington, as my last example, I promise, goes into my gap that I was talking about earlier. But University of Washington, when they were renovating their stadium, Husky Stadium again, Bob Woodward, the athletic director at the time, completely bought in to environmental sustainability. It was a directive also from the university president. And so it made it very quickly to be able to implement those things. And then after the stadium project was done, the kind of foot came off the proverbial pedal and wasn't pushing forward. And the same thing we saw with Arthur Blank and the directives that he had, or Kroenke in their stadium project down in Los Angeles. And we see Kroenke's obviously leadership across all his sport properties in Denver, over in the UK, and also Southern California. But with that directive with Kroenke and Arthur Blank, make this stadium as sustainable as possible, because the stadium is seen as a long-term investment, and it's worthwhile to invest on the front end rather than paying on the back end with regards to being as efficient as possible.
If I could come to you, Madeleine, and just begin to wrap up, and I call you Madeleine, Maddie. If I can come to you, Maddie, to wrap. So how do you establish when something has been achieved? How do you measure this? What are the ways in which we know we've made an improvement, or we've made steps forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's one of when you're talking about enablers and things that inhibit progress, that was one of the things that I'd written down in my notes is, do you have the information you need to do what you got to do? And one of the perceptions is that it's really hard to measure these things. The reality is often you do have the data already that you need, right? Or you've got some of it, or it's easy to access. And so, there's a number of ways to measure the impacts you have on your fans and their attitudes and behaviors. This is work that Brian's done. This is work that some of our colleagues have done as well. This can be done obviously through surveys, but there's also a number of opportunities to collect data on social media. Marketing departments do this already to measure the impact of other things they're working on. They know how. It's just a case of applying it to sustainability, which is not something they've been trained to do, right? It's not, when we train marketers, we don't train them to measure sustainability, but often these things go together. The other big ones are measuring your carbon footprint is the big one. This is like the mecca. We talk about carbon neutral, right? And this is something that for many organizations at the moment is probably not totally possible, but definitely within their grasp within a few really strategic moves in the next few years and over time. And so when we talk about carbon GHG emissions and measuring that, we talk about 3 scopes. So scope 1 is your own organization, your building, your own footprint, what you've done as an organization. So that's stuff that you can get from your energy utility bill, your water bill, the haulage information, right? So when you have a waste hauler come in, pick up your stuff, often they weigh it. These are things that we don't often talk about. And again, that's kind of the dirty work of sustainability that we don't hear about, but those numbers are really important. And you usually have that information in-house already. When we get to scope 2, we're talking about all the kind of affiliated pieces associated with the organization. So we're talking about staff travel, we're talking about your immediate suppliers and so on. This is information that often you have to get from a second party, but it's available. And often this is something you can build in contractually. So if you've got a supplier who's sending you X amount of stuff, it's not that complicated to say, I need to see on the receipt where it's coming from and how it's being shipped, right? And then you've got that information, very simple calculation to be done there. Scope 3 is where it gets complicated. Scope 3 is your fans. Scope 3 is your participants. Scope 3 is all the stuff that happens outside of the event and more or less the externalities, right? If we want to talk about economic terms. And so this is something that gets included when we talk about an economic impact on an event, and not so much included when we talk about the environmental impact, because we like to emphasize one being huge and emphasize the other being small. So this is where we cut those lines, right? Brian and I would advocate to include that, and make some people uncomfortable sometimes because it's the biggest number, the biggest contributor to overall emissions and overall output. The good news is it is doable, right? There's some very rudimentary math that can be done using zip codes found in ticket purchase data, right? When people buy a ticket, they put their credit card in, they also put their address. We know where they're coming from. We know how many of them are coming from there. So it's not perfect, totally doable though. And we can measure, I think the other big thing to think about over time is we can measure the overall opinions of your target market. And that doesn't have to be something that you can measure it yourself. Absolutely. Again, surveys, social media information, how they're responding or not responding to activations on site. We can also talk about, the available information that's out there for free from organizations like the Yale Climate Opinion Maps, right? This is a lab at Yale University that releases annually a map of every county and every city in the USA and says, here's how they feel on 6 or 7, I think, items related to climate opinions. A similar project it has in Canada, the Climate Atlas of Canada has a similar project. There's other ones run by the Met in the UK, Metropolitan Data, I forget what it's called, something related to weather. It's like the Weather Network that does it.
So the Met Office.
There we go.
Yeah.
So they have something similar. So you can get this information and then just track, this is how much my community cares, and then match, use that as part of the business case Brian was talking about. This is how we bring people to the table. This is how we get them involved, is just showing, look, actually more people care about this than you might think.
And to conclude, first Brian, then Maddie, to conclude, is there anything more or anything important that you think the people who are going to listen to this and watch it should know about sport and the environment?
Yeah, so working with the college athletic department, one of the things that we pitch to them is that they have resources at their disposal, academics that study this, whether it be someone in a sport business program or within sociology, marketing, whatever program that could help them with this, with this work. And academics are always looking for some high quality data. And that's the same thing I think that practitioners that are in professional organizations might be missing, is that there's opportunities there for collaboration and at least someone to provide a new perspective. Whether they choose to go that direction, they can at least enrich their conversations that they're going on internally. And kind of picking back again off of what Maddie was saying about the data, one of my master's students that's going to be, she'll be a doctoral student here, Lauren Lichterman, she ran the sustainability initiatives at the University of Texas Athletic Department. And now she's here. Her perspectives to me are invaluable from the standpoint that she's able to analyze waste audit data better than anyone I've ever known and have come across. And from those aspects, she's able to develop strategic plans. And now with this academic background that she's gaining, her insights and the work that she's doing are tremendous. And so I think there's a lot of value that's there. Again, kind of collecting the data and then making sense of it, and knowing that there is a roadmap to be had, whether that's from the basic frames and principles from the Sports for Climate Action framework, or the different recommendations that are coming down from the IOC or the Commonwealth. Those aspects can help clarify, because it might seem like it's like you're drinking out of a fire hose and not manageable. And those aspects, I think, make it more manageable for sport practitioners to move from. And if you still feel overwhelmed, check out Sport Ecology Group. We can help you out, I promise.
And check out this book as well, which is very good.
Yeah, those authors are the co-editors are pretty good too.
Yeah.
My biased opinion.
I've noticed that. Maddie, is there any kind of one final word that you say, look out for this, everyone? This is really, really important. We haven't discussed it so far.
Yeah, my big one would be, look in the other direction of the sport ecology relationship, right? The impacts that climate has on sports. The worst of the impacts can be avoided and prevented. We do not, like, heat illness among athletes is 100% a preventable outcome. We do not have to have athletes experiencing heat illness, right? A lot of these big problems in terms of having, ski resorts closing, in terms of having major disasters causing damage to facilities, a lot of this is preventable. And so we can't necessarily control the climate impacts themselves, right? Those hazards. What we can do is be ready for them, right? And it's the same as just matching your readiness to the degree of threat that you're facing. And this is something every organization can take on. It doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to cost a lot of money. In some cases, it might be like, yeah, you need to build a new facility, but that's rare. Often it's as simple as Brian mentioned, we need to have a better natural disaster policy for how we return and when we decide it's safe to return. Or we need to have a better policy for including more water breaks at a certain temperature threshold. Very simple steps that can be taken. And it's just a case of helping people be aware that we have more agency than we think we do. It's just a case of acting on it and acting proactively, as opposed to after the fact when you're stuck in a rebuild period.
So Maddie, thank you. Brian, thank you. I'm really, really interested to sit and listen to you and to hear the things that you're saying. And I particularly like your philosophy of firstly using examples, which I think is really important to illustrate, but also not being distant, remote academics, actually being there and working with organizations, working with people that will make a difference. So thank you very much for being here with us today.
Merci.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.